author, Dinesh D'Souza, wants to trace the idea of the equal worth of all human beings to the Christian faith. Okay, so I'm going to start out by simply quoting Thomas Jefferson when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He said the following: "We hold these truths to be self-evident," which is another way of saying they're obvious to everybody, okay? We don't have to argue about these. They're just plain obvious. "That all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." In other words, certain rights that that no human being has the right to take away, because these rights were endowed by the person who created us. And then he lists those rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so where did Thomas Jefferson get the idea that that these things are self-evident? Back in 1776, which was a very different time from ours, that all people were created equal was not an idea that most cultures would have found to be self-evident in any way, shape, or form. For example, in India, they had the caste system. People were not were thought to be created equal. I'm not being judgmental here. I'm just giving you the facts of it because I've studied Hinduism very carefully. The same is true in Buddhism. And the same is true in the Muslim world. This was a unique concept. The only other area in the world where this would have sounded vaguely familiar would have been Western Europe. And even there, in some countries, there was not equality quite yet. The French Revolution hadn't taken place yet. It was in process of happening. It happened after our revolution. In Britain, there was this idea of liberty and representative government, so it would have been most likely to look familiar to people living there, but not so much in other places. So where did the idea come from? Well, let's go all the way back to the beginnings of the Christian church for a moment. Christianity was born in 30 AD. Okay, this was the time of the Roman Empire, and in the Roman Empire, society was very much stratified. Okay, that is to say, at the top was the emperor. Then you had the Roman Senate. The Roman senators were large landowners, members of the aristocracy, people with a lot of money and large estates and land holdings. Then you had the common people, the laborers. I think they were called plebes or something like that. And then you had slaves at the bottom of the rung. Now, in the midst of this highly stratified society, which you can see even enshrined in Roman law, for example, why was Jesus, when he was executed, why did they use crucifixion? Because he was considered a common criminal and not a Roman citizen. And crucifixion was reserved for people who were lowest on the status rung. Okay, and like I've mentioned before, the Apostle Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, well, he got the advantage of being beheaded instead of crucified. So my point is this: in the midst of this highly stratified society, these little Christian communities began to develop. And what was so odd to everybody about these Christian communities was the fact that, and you can see this in the letters of Paul very clearly, the fact that no matter who was a member of these communities, whether it was a slave or a wealthy merchant like Lydia, who was a dealer in purple cloth, or someone like Paul, who was a highly educated person, no matter who it was, they were all treated equally, and they were all considered of equal moral worth. Why? Because, well, there are a couple of reasons for that. Some people, Gentiles, would not have been aware of this, but for the Jewish Christians who knew the Bible, the story of creation says that God created us in the image of God. Okay, so for the Jews, it's obvious that everyone has equal moral worth in the eyes of God because we're all created in the image and likeness of God. But for most Christians at that time, the idea of equal worth came from the fact that Jesus died for who? Who did he die for? Question, real question. Who did he die for?
Us.
Us, everybody, right?
Us.
Every human being he stood in for as an act of divine love. Okay, so on that basis, okay, Paul could write in his letter to the Galatians, there's neither slave nor free, male or female, Jew or Greek, meaning Gentile. All are one in Christ. Okay, so the equal moral worth of all people was a bedrock value of the early Christian church. And as a result of that, even before the apostles died off, as the church was just getting its bearings, just beginning to spread, there also developed within it a diaconate. And the diaconate developed because it was necessary to have people who were available to care for the vulnerable and the poor. People who couldn't feed themselves, widows who couldn't support themselves, orphans who couldn't support themselves, any dependent person. And it was made clear, we read this in the book of Acts, it was made clear that everyone was to be equally treated, no matter who they were, whether Gentile or Jew or slave or whatever. So this idea of the equal moral worth of all people, de Souza believes, comes ultimately from the Christian faith. And it's obviously clear that the Christian faith held that value, and that it wasn't an accident that it was in a country that was largely Christian where someone would find it, what's the word I'm looking for, would find it clear to say the word, this truth is self-evident. In other words, everybody accepts this as true, because coming from the Christian heritage, that is what we're taught, that is what we believe, that is a part of who we are as a Christian community. Okay, so what kind of equality, when Jefferson wrote those words, what kind of equality was he talking about? Because on the face of it, we're not all equal, right? Some people are smarter than others. I'll never forget when I was in high school, I showed up for tryouts for the football team. And the coach just told me to take a hike. He didn't think I had the talent to be on the team. So, you know, I wasn't created equal in that sense. You know, some people are more talented in many different areas. So in what sense are we equal? Real question. What sense, how would you define our equality?
Equal opportunity.
Okay, equal opportunity becomes a part of what grows out of that. One of the values that grows out of our equality, in the sense that we are equal in the eyes of God, equal opportunity grows out of that. What Jefferson was referring to is that we have equal moral worth in the eyes of God. Not that we're all the same. We aren't all the same, but we have equal moral worth. And because we have equal moral worth, everyone should be treated equally. Okay? Now, out of that, a lot of different things comes. But before I get to that, just to give you some idea of how influential this idea has become in our, not just in our country, but in the whole, you know, societies around the world, the opening charter of the United Nations says specifically, I wrote these down. In the opening charter of the United Nations, there's a Declaration of Human Rights. And it says the following. Number one, everyone has freedom of conscience. Okay? Meaning freedom to choose what you believe and what you don't believe. Number two, the will of the people is the basis of the authority of government. In other words, because our conscience belongs to God, not to any human authority, right? Remember last week we talked about Luther when he said, my conscience is captive to the word of God, and so I can't recant what I've written. Because our conscience belongs to God and not to any human authority, that takes away certain powers from, say, for example, the state, or a person's clan, or a person's race, or a person's ethnic origin, whatever it might be. Anything of human origin has no authority over your conscience. So because of that, government has its authority only by our consent, right? See, if we have the right to live our own lives freely as we choose, because everybody is of equal moral worth, then government derives its legitimacy from the consent of those who are governed. Now, the way that works in practice is that we get to vote, right? We get to vote for who represents us. It doesn't always work real well because some people just plain have more influence than others do, but that's the theory anyway. Okay, the theory is that government is by the consent of the governed. All right, and the third right is the right to marry the person of your choosing. That's not always practiced. I even have my oldest son has a friend. I may have told you this story. I don't remember all the stories I've shared with you, but has a friend from Hong Kong, and they engaged in an arranged marriage. Arranged marriages are still not uncommon in various places, various parts of the globe. Yeah. But according to the United Nations, we have the right to marry the person of our choosing. It excludes torture or inhumane punishment. All should be equal before the law. In other words, we don't have we don't have a justice system for some people and then another justice system for others, like the Romans did. We have the right to life, liberty, and property, and we have the right for equal pay for equal work. So all of those things are in the United Nations, and all of that is derived from the notion of the moral equality of all human beings. Because we have moral equality, we have certain rights that no one can take away from us. Okay, now, how well do you think our society has lived up to this ideal? How well have we done?
It took quite a while for women to get the right to vote and for the slaves to be freed, and at least from the start of our country. And we're still working on that.
You're absolutely right. That's correct. Okay, so let's talk about those two issues for just a moment. I think those are both good points. The one issue, the right of women to vote, relates to the tendency on the part of most cultures, not just in the West, but most cultures, to be patriarchal, right? The head is the guys. The men are the heads of the household, are the heads of government, are the heads of everything, right? So, I mean, we see this in the Bible. In the story of salvation, it begins with a guy by the name of Abraham, and it continues with Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And what do we call those guys?
Patriarchs.
Patriarchs, exactly. Okay. Patriarchal society predates Christianity by thousands of years, right? Okay. So Christianity did not create patriarchal society. Christianity was introduced into the world where patriarchal society already existed. All right. Now let's talk about slavery. The same thing with slavery. Slavery was so common in the ancient world that in the city of Athens, there were more slaves than free people. It was common in the ancient world that when one army prevailed over another army, the army that was defeated were all sold into slavery. So slavery was extremely common. And it was common among, in the society Jesus moved in, because he has slaves in his parables all over the place. Okay, so once again, slavery predates Christianity. However, in both of those cases, patriarchy and slavery, what is the value that ultimately was used to correct these injustices? How did we correct them? On what basis? Was it because we just decided, well, women ought to have the right to vote too, or does that come from someplace? Or slavery? Did we decide slavery is a bad thing? We should just get rid of it? Or does it,
Wasn't it mostly Paul, though, that said there is no slave, no free, no Greek, and all that? Did Jesus actually say that too?
Okay, so now Jesus didn't, so far as we know, there's nothing in the Gospels that records Jesus making a comment about slavery other than the fact that he treated slaves the same way he treated everybody else. Okay. there is one section of the New Testament that deals with slavery, and that is the book of Philemon, which is a letter of Paul. It's a very short little letter in the New Testament. What happened is that a slave escaped from his master. His master's name was Philemon. And this slave's name was Onesimus. And Onesimus was a helper of the Apostle Paul, okay, for a period of time. So Paul decided to return Onesimus to his master, Philemon, but he did so with this letter. And in the letter, Paul says, I return Onesimus, your slave, to you, Philemon, but I know out of your respect for me and out of your faith in Christ, you will treat Onesimus as a brother and not as a slave. Okay, so that's the reference in the New Testament. Ultimately, what I'm getting at is that the corrective value or ideal behind the women's suffragette movement or the women's movement for the right to vote, the women's movement for equal pay for equal work, or the abolitionist movement during, that predated the Civil War. And speaking of the Civil War, a lot of people think, well, good old Abe Lincoln, he fought the war not to end slavery, but to preserve the Union. But that's not true. That's the way it started out. But in 1862, okay, Lincoln knew that he needed a higher cause in order to maintain the support of European countries for the Northern cause. All right. So, and this was his intent all along anyway. But in 1862, he writes the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all the slaves in the rebelling states. And now the Civil War becomes not just a war to preserve the Union, but a war also to end slavery. Okay, so there's that aspect of it in the Civil War era. But if you go all the way forward now to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, there again, what was the basis that Black leaders had for advocating for the civil rights legislation? Think about what Martin Luther King said in his I Have a Dream speech. Do you remember that speech?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I remember it like, I was just a kid. But I was born in 55, so if it was around I may have been around 10 years old or something like that when that speech was delivered, but I remember it. And what does he quote in that speech? He quotes the Declaration of Independence. That's what he quotes. All men are created equal. So once again, my point is that even though we have not always lived up to the ideal of equality of all people, we still have the ideal, and the ideal enables us to correct the wrongs that have been committed in the past. So it's like an infrastructure that has the strength to self-correct. That's the idea behind this. So this idea of human equality is the very thing that has enabled us also not just to found a nation, a democratic republic, but also to continue to make progress in the ways in which we embody that equality in our society. And as you said, it continues to this day. Okay. I want to talk for a second about how this idea of equality has played itself out in some other historical contexts. For example, you all have heard of the Nuremberg Trials, right? You know what the Nuremberg Trials were? The trials of the Nazis after World War II. Okay. So what was the defense that the Allies created this court in Nuremberg to try those people in Germany who participated in the Holocaust. Okay, what was their defense? Well, their defense was very simple. They said at the trials, we were simply obeying the laws of Germany as they existed at that time. That was their defense. We were obeying the law. Okay. So if you believe that every nation in the world has its own independent freedom to decide how it's going to govern itself, how could the Allies find a basis for convicting people who were just obeying the laws of their country? How did they do that? Does anybody know?
Higher law, right?
What's that?
It was a higher law.
That's exactly right, Marianne. The prosecutor from the United States gave a speech at that trial. And in that speech, he said, there is a higher law than the law of nations. There is a transcendent law. And where did he get that idea? Well, he got that idea straight out of the Bible, okay? There is a higher law. It's the same basis that Luther used for his reforms, the same basis Thomas Jefferson used for independence, the same basis that freedom fighters everywhere have used. And that is that there is a law that trumps any human law, okay? And that is the law that, as Jefferson put it, we have been endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so because the Nazis betrayed that higher law, that gave the Allies the justification they needed to convict them of these crimes. So the influence of this Christian idea of universal human equality has been extremely influential throughout history, and not just in the West, but also, for example, when Gandhi was advocating for the independence of India from the British Empire, same arguments. You know, there's a higher law here, and that law trumps any law that that human beings may or may not pass. Okay, I want to mention two events in American history that helped shape our idea of freedom and human rights, and how they fit together. Because if you believe in the universal equality of all people before God and certain inalienable rights that all people have been endowed with by their Creator, that means that government does not have the right to encroach on those freedoms that you have in virtue of being a person created in the image of God. Okay, and what are some of those freedoms? Well, there were two events that took place in American history that helped to define this. The first one was called the First Great Awakening. Has anybody heard of this before?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the First Great Awakening was a religious revival. It took place in the mid-1700s, and it was under the leadership of an Oxford-educated cleric by the name of George Whitfield, and the famous American theologian, Puritan, Jonathan Edwards, who most people to this day believe was the greatest American theologian who ever lived, along with Reinhold Niebuhr. Okay, so Jonathan Edwards and George Whitfield initiated a religious revival, okay? And at that point in time, America was largely just an East Coast, settlement. It was just the colonies along the eastern seaboard that existed. We hadn't moved beyond the Appalachian Mountains yet. And so this religious revival had a huge impact on the ultimate decision on the part of each of these colonies to declare their independence from Great Britain. Okay, it was this religious revival, this idea that we've been given certain rights in virtue of having been created in the image and likeness of God, and the British Empire is trampling on those rights. Therefore, we have the right to break our ties with that government. That was the basic argument. That was why we had the Boston Tea Party, right? What was the excuse me? What was the slogan that these people who engaged in the Boston Tea Party, what did they say when they threw the tea?
Taxation without representation.
Exactly. Taxation without representation. They were taxing tea. And they said, well, wait a minute, you're imposing a tax on us, and we didn't give our consent for that tax, right? Because we have no say in who sits in Parliament. So we're throwing the tea overboard. And that's exactly what they did. All right, so that set off a chain of events that eventually leads to the American Revolution. But then there was a second Great Awakening that took place it started in the, I don't know the exact dates, but it was in the 1900s, okay? And what happened during the Second Great Awakening is by the mid-1900s, okay, just before the Civil War, the nation had expanded because under Jefferson's administration, he was the third president elected in, I think, 1800 or 1802, something like that. Under his administration, was the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, he purchased this huge swath of land from North Dakota and Montana to the west, all the way south to Louisiana, and everything from there east to the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, so that land started to get settled very quickly, and we admitted a number of states, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Indiana, all kinds of states began to come into the Union. But one of the problems that existed for the church at that time was that there were thousands and thousands of people living in all of these settlements on what was then considered the frontier, but there were no churches and there were no clergy to serve these people. So what did they do? They sent out people who today are referred to as evangelicals. What they did is they would, these roving preachers would go from town to town, and they would have what was called a revival. You know, they'd set up a big tent and there would be a revival. And there were mass conversions that were taking place on the frontier, okay? And as a result of these mass conversions, the church spread rapidly throughout the frontier. What grew out of that were a number of movements, okay? One of them was the Temperance Movement, because during these revivals, one of the things that was condemned because it was abused and was associated with violence was alcohol. All right, so you had the Temperance Movement. And of course, ultimately that led to prohibition, but well, that kind of didn't work too well. Okay, so we decided to change our minds about that. Anyway, you had the Temperance Movement, and you also had the beginnings of the women's suffragette movement. Okay, so the beginnings of the movement to give women the right to vote can be traced to the Second Great Awakening. All right, so so you can see in this country how Christianity's emphasis on the equal moral worth of each individual person has resulted in big social reform movements throughout our history. And of course, that includes the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Okay. There's one distinction that D'Souza makes in terms of types of human rights doctrines. Okay, there are two types. One he calls moral doctrines. Okay, what's an example of a moral human rights doctrine? Well, the example he gives is the just war theory. Now, the just war theory has a fascinating history. And I just want to give you in a nutshell what that is, because it helps to illustrate some of the inherent conflicts in human existence that have bedeviled us throughout our history. Okay, according to the just war theory, and this originates with St. Augustine. St. Augustine was the great theologian from North Africa who lived in the late 4th century AD. Okay, according to the just war theory, you can enter into a war and have moral justification for it if it meets the following criteria. Number one, it's a defensive war. In other words, you are defending yourself against an outside aggressor. You can't start a war, but you can defend yourself against one. Okay? Number two, civilians need to be protected from the violence. Okay, that's part of the just war theory. Civilians are off limits when it comes to a just war. Number three, it has to be proportionate. In other words, if to put it simply, if some group killed 10 people from one clan, that clan doesn't have the right to kill 1,000 people in the other clan. It's got to be proportionate. Okay, so it remains just as long as you don't do worse than the aggressor has done against you. Okay, now this idea, the church had tried to hold on to this idea of a just war theory, but it eventually fell apart. And this is why it fell apart. Okay, it fell apart first during the Civil War. And it was General Grant and General Sherman who came to the conclusion that the South was never going to give up fighting until the North engaged in what they called total war. Okay? What total war was, an example of that was General Sherman's march through Georgia and South Carolina. When his army marched after capturing Atlanta, his march to the sea through South Carolina in particular, they destroyed everything. They burned down every plantation. They absconded with all the livestock. In other words, they destroyed the entire civilization of the big planter society of the South. They just destroyed it. And the reason, the justification they gave for that was that the South was never going to give up until it became absolutely, totally, and completely impossible for them to keep fighting. All right? So that was their justification. Now, the same thing happened again in World War II, right? So in World War II, I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that the Allies engaged in indiscriminate bombing of German cities, killing thousands of civilians. We dropped 2 atom bombs on Japan, destroying 2 cities. Okay, what was the justification for that? Well, they used the same argument. The Germans and the Japanese were never, ever going to give up fighting until it became so totally impossible to keep up the fight that they just finally gave in. Okay. So what's the point of all this? Well, the point really is that this higher moral law that we would like to hold up and live by hasn't worked out very well. Okay. Now, the second type of human rights are legal rights. So the idea there is that if you are a person created in the image of God, who has therefore been given certain inalienable rights, that means you need to be given the freedom to make your own decisions on how you live your life. All right, so the freedoms that most Americans are familiar with and the freedoms that we fight for probably have less to do with the right to vote. Yes, that's very important. But the freedoms that people cherish are freedoms like the freedom to decide what kind of career I'm going to have, the freedom to decide what my religion or lack thereof is going to be, the freedom to decide where I'm going to live, the freedom to decide whether or not to travel, the freedom to buy and sell property, the freedom to earn my own living. All of that, all of these freedoms grew out of the idea of the equal moral worth of each individual human being.
Now we've added a new one onto that with the freedom to wear masks or not. That's a big, big issue. Yes.
Yeah. I know. And I'm familiar with the arguments on both sides, but I don't think I want to get into that one. Yeah, you know, obviously the justification for requiring masks is clearly that you don't want to spread the virus, right? So that's, you know, that's the justification that government has to pass regulations related to this pandemic, which limit our freedoms. I mean, let's face it, some of our freedoms have been limited because of this pandemic. But the idea is that we're doing it for the purpose of keeping people safe. That's the idea. Okay,
yeah.
So
disagreement on whether that itself is correct. What is keeping people safe? And now the big issue back here, at least in Ohio, is when are our kids going to go to school again? I mean, we're still doing school at home, and parents are just going nuts. Yeah,
I think that's happening in a lot of places.
Yeah.
It's a very difficult line to walk between safety and legitimate freedoms. However, I want to, before we conclude the study, I want to share with you an interesting article I read yesterday. I get an email from the Apple Corporation called Apple News every week. Well, I think it's every day. Anyway, I get this thing often, right? Usually I don't have time to read it, so I just delete it. But yesterday, a couple of articles caught my attention, so I decided to read them. And one of the articles was about how Americans during the pandemic have become actually more mobile than they've ever been before. In other words, people are moving in record numbers to different parts of the country.
Oh, that kind of ability.
Okay. Yeah. Now, wow. I'm going to ask you an interesting question. Which state do you think is getting the highest growth in terms of the number of people moving in?
Texas.
Nope, it's not. That's what I would have guessed.
Florida?
No, it isn't Florida.
South Dakota.
Well, no. It's actually Idaho.
All right.
Yeah, it's Idaho.
Idaho, and I thought, nah.
Yeah. No, it's actually Idaho. Yeah, it's most of the people going to Idaho are leaving Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and LA.
Yes.
Can't blame them.
Yeah. Anyway, but that's not California is one of the states people are moving out of, partly because of high taxes and other things. High cost of real estate probably is the biggest reason. But also New York has lost, I think, more residents even than California has. And that's where Florida kicks in. A lot of those people are going to Florida. Yeah. But anyway, even though we're in the midst of a pandemic, that has not stopped people from moving around. That is for sure. Okay, so what I would just like to leave you with is this brief conundrum. Humanity bequeathed to us a lot of our cherished values of the freedom to associate, the freedom to believe as we choose, the freedom to hold the opinions we want, the freedom to live where we want, the freedom to earn our own living, to choose who we marry and not marry. All of these freedoms, okay, are all based on the equal worth of every human individual before God, and that that the only authority that we are ultimately accountable to is our Creator. Now, that doesn't mean we aren't accountable to the laws of the land. The laws, God has ordained government in order to see to it that we have peace and order in our society. Okay, so that doesn't take away government, but it means that the highest allegiance is to a divine authority. And it's on that basis that we get these declarations of universal human rights. Now, we have seen in the West a decline in the numbers of people who are actively involved in the Christian church. That is unmistakable, okay? In Europe, it's gone much further even than in the US, and we see it in the US quite a lot as well. So the question for the future is, if you take away the worldview and the beliefs that are bequeathed on us from our religious heritage, are we ultimately, in the end, going to also lose those values? Will we become susceptible to the rise? And I can tell you as an historical fact that Adolf Hitler showed propaganda films to the German people during his rise to power, okay, that absolutely denigrated Christianity as a religion of weakness, because a crucified man was your savior. Hitler thought that was just awful. That's a sign of weakness. Okay, what he believed in was the survival of the fittest and the superiority of the Aryan race. And so on that basis, he felt justified in murdering people who didn't live up to the standard, right? That's how we got the Holocaust, okay? So the question for the future is, if we lose the infrastructure of our values, which is the Christian faith, what's going to happen? What are we going to see in our society?
We're already seeing.
Yeah, right.
I'm thinking of abortion and the number of, I don't know how to describe it other than murdering children has occurred, and that's changed because of the lack of Christian values. It's going to be drastic, I think.
Yeah, it's on its way too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's something to think about. Okay, so our study next week is going to be interesting. There was a book written, I don't know, but maybe about 150 years ago, that suggested that Christianity and science were at war with each other, and that they were, that scientific truth was being assaulted by religious fanatics and so forth. Okay, so the question that we want to look at next week, and that is the next chapter of the book, is the relationship between Christianity and science. It's a fascinating story. I think you'll enjoy it. So I hope to see you again next week.